carefully weigh the future of the Veterans Affairs Department, Veterans Health Administration, and any related authorized programs. For these reasons, I respectfully oppose the amendment offered by my colleague, Mr. Lynch. Does any member seek recognition? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment offered by Mr. Lynch. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to request a roll call.
The gentleman requests a recorded vote. Recorded vote is ordered. As previously announced, further proceedings on the question will be postponed. Seeing that there are no further amendments on the bill, we will now take up for consideration H.R. 3230, Unfunded Mandates, Accountability, and Transparency. The clerk will please report the bill.
H.R. 3230, Unfunded Mandates, Accountability, and Transparency Bill to amend the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act of 1995 to provide for regulatory impact analysis for certain rules and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill shall be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. The chair recognizes himself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will please report the amendment.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3230 as offered by Mr. Comer of Kentucky.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the substitute will be considered as original text for the purposes of further amendment. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill and the amendment. I support H.R. 3230, the Unfunded Mandates, Accountability, and Transparency Act. First introduced several Congresses ago and still very much needed, this bill strengthens the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act of 1995. UMRA formed part of the original contract with America. It attempted to bring the flood of unfunded mandates issued to states, localities, and tribal governments by the federal bureaucracy under control. It was later amended to help stem the flow of unreasonably costly mandates imposed upon the private sector. But unfortunately, federal regulatory agencies have typically treated this compliance as a box-checking exercise and not a true constraint on their activities. Thus, the flood of unfunded mandates has continued. This has been particularly true under the Biden administration. Just last month, this committee received testimony that costs imposed by the new Biden administration regulations in 2021 and 2022 equal $10,000 per household. And it gets worse. Witnesses before this committee estimated that if President Biden gets a full 2 terms in office, which is doubtful, the ultimate burden imposed by his administration's regulations could approach a mind-boggling $60,000 per household. That is nearly the annual U.S. median household income. Thankfully, there are solutions. One of the most important is to enact the Unfunded Mandates, Accountability, and Transparency Act. This bill strengthens, is it UMRA? How do you say that? UMRA. In numerous ways, these acronyms. The bill will help bring down the cost of unfunded mandates imposed by regulation upon states, localities, tribal governments, and the private sector. It increases earlier stakeholder engagement on rules that may impose costly mandates, better positioning stakeholders to help agencies identify ways to achieve goals at lower cost. It extends UMRA to independent agencies. It requires agencies to prepare regulatory impact analyses, including analyses of costs, benefits, alternatives, disproportionate impacts, and effects on jobs. For major rules that mandate economic impacts of $100 million or more, present major increases in cost or prices, or have significant adverse effects on competition, employment, or markets. It requires agencies to publish initial assessments in the Federal Register and receive public comment in response to notices of proposed rulemaking. And it requires final agency regulatory impact analyses to accompany notices on final rulemaking. These and other provisions in the bill ensure agencies will better analyze the potential costs of newly proposed mandates. H.R. 3230 ensures agencies will collect better information and inform the public about those costs and alternative ways to achieve agency goals. Therefore, agencies will have stronger incentives to bring the cost of unfunded mandates down. And I thank Dr. Fox for her unwavering efforts over several Congresses to enact this bill into law. I urge my colleagues to support this critical bipartisan reform bill, and I now recognize the ranking member for his statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I oppose the legislation. As we discussed at length in our June hearing on regulations, most Americans support government regulation across a whole range of industries because they enable us to feel confident that the food we eat and the water we drink and the air we breathe will be safe for human consumption. That's why we have regulations. Regulations help curb the worst abuses of the alcohol and tobacco industries. The few meager regulations we have over firearms, including the Brady background check, have saved lots of lives, although we need to be going a lot further there. But I think Americans understand that regulations are an essential component of the American governmental system, and indeed governance, democratic governance all over the world. Regulations translate the legislative purposes and enactments of government into actual rules for the road and deliver concrete benefits to all of our people. The H.R. 3230, as far as I can understand it, and I must confess I had a very difficult time understanding what this will do, and maybe somebody could explain it in more detail, but as far as I get it, 3230 will make an already complex regulatory process even more complicated and burdensome, and give the most powerful private actors and corporations even more power over the regulatory process. In contrast, in April, President Biden issued an executive order to modernize the regulatory process, strengthening democracy by advancing the values of transparency, inclusivity, and effectiveness of regulations. So Biden's regulatory modernization plans, which I understand promote both efficiency and fairness. Well-funded and well-connected corporations should no longer have outsized influence over the federal rulemaking process simply because they've got the time and the resources and the lawyers to bombard federal officials with their points of view and their meeting requests. The Biden changes require federal officials to proactively seek out the voices of those people who otherwise would be underrepresented in, even if still critically affected by the rulemaking process, including people living in rural areas, people in minority groups, and people with disabilities. This bill would undermine that effort by only allowing the consideration of alternatives to implementing regulations that take into account only the strict financial costs and benefits within the scope of the statutory provision that authorize the rulemaking procedure. This is not the best way to increase public participation or welcome public views or to reduce opaqueness in the regulatory process. It's a thinly veiled effort to expand the power of private actors over the regulatory process and to hamstring federal agencies. This is part of the assault on the ability of federal agencies to implement congressional will and to impose more red tape on them. The aim of this effort is to elevate the interests of private concerns over agency expertise in service of the public good. The bill would be the first amendment to the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act in almost 20 years. The changes are sweeping, and the committee, at the very least, must examine them more thoroughly so we even understand what we're voting on. I read it several times and could not really make heads or tails of it, but at the very least, we should first have a hearing on the legislation and its far-reaching consequences so at least the members of the committee can explain what's in there. Regulations are a tool in our democracy that necessarily will serve the public good. Despite claims to the contrary, this bill will hinder, not improve, the regulatory process. We want to make sure that the rules and regulations that are coming out of the regulatory process really serve the public interest and not the interests of private actors. For that reason, I oppose this legislation, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Chair recognizes Dr. Fox for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Before I begin, let me ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the following documents: a letter to this committee in support of the Unfunded Mandates Accountability and Transparency Act from the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and a letter to the committee in support of the Unfunded Mandates Accountability and Transparency Act from the National Taxpayers Union.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this bill, in almost this same form has passed the House 3 or 4 times already, sometimes as a standalone, sometimes with other pieces of legislation designed to improve our regulatory process. The cost of existing federal regulations are staggering and estimated to exceed $2 trillion. This figure doesn't even account for the Biden administration's new regulatory burdens, which this committee recently learned add up to over $10,000 per household. I believe you mentioned that, Mr. Chairman. We need to stop adding to the regulatory burden that threatens to choke off innovation and economic growth in this country. That's why I introduced H.R. 3230, the Unfunded Mandates Accountability and Transparency Act, or UMATA. This bill will strengthen Congress's ability to stop federal regulators from loading up the private sector, the state and local governments with costly new unfunded mandates. UMATA requires federal agencies to consider accurately the cost of their regulations, consult with stakeholders, publish their assessments, and ensure that any new regulations produce the most benefits for the least cost. It also closes key loopholes in the 1995 Unfunded Mandates Reform Act, or UMRA. This is a bipartisan bill that will prevent the federal government from crushing Americans under an ever-growing mountain of costly regulations and unfunded mandates. I want to point out again that these unfunded mandates and regulations come not from the Congress, those of us elected to serve the people, but from unelected bureaucrats who write regulations based on legislation. So I urge my colleagues to support the bill, and I yield back.
Does any other member wish to speak on the amendment or on the bill? Seeing none, the question is now on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The question is now on favorably reporting H.R. 3230 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill.
Mr. Chairman,
Dr. Fox.
I'd like to ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been requested and ordered. As previously announced, further proceedings on the question will be postponed. Pursuant to the previous order, the chair declares the committee in recess subject to the call of the chair. The committee will reconvene at 3 p.m. The committee stands in recess.